Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Hope you guys are doing good. This is part 3 of the video on anatomy of triangles of the neck. So without wasting any more time, let's get started. In previous video, we completed the suboccipital triangle. For this video, we will discuss the posterior triangle of the neck and the sternocleidomastoid region. Let's start with the posterior triangle of the neck. The lateral cervical region constitutes the posterior triangle of the neck. The borders include the anterior border, bounded by the posterior border of the sternocleidomastoid anteriorly, posterior border, bounded by the anterior border of the trapezius posteriorly, inferior border, that is the middle third of the clavicle between the trapezius and the sternocleidomastoid, superior border, that is an apex where the sternocleidomastoid and trapezius meet on the superior nuchal line of the occipital bone. Roof, that is the investing layer of deep cervical fascia. And the floor, that is formed by the muscles covered by the prevertebral layer of deep cervical fascia. You will understand it better when we will look at these borders, but before that, let's discuss the contents of the posterior triangle. The contents include vessels and nerves. Vessels include third part of the subclavian artery, suprascapular and transverse cervical branches of the thyrocervical trunk, and the external jugular vein. And nerves include the accessory nerve, the trunks of the brachial plexus, and the fibers of the cervical plexus. Let's have a look. This is the lateral view of the neck. This is the posterior border of the sternocleidomastoid that makes up the anterior border. This is the anterior border of the trapezius that makes up the posterior border. This is the middle third of clavicle between the trapezius and the sternocleidomastoid that makes up the inferior border. And this is the apex form where the sternocleidomastoid and trapezius meet on the superior nuchal line of the occipital bone. So this is the posterior triangle of the neck. The posterior triangle has two subtriangles in it, that are the omoclavicular triangle and the occipital triangle. So let's discuss each of them separately and see the borders and contents of these triangles. Starting with the omoclavicular triangle. The borders of this triangle are the superior border, formed by the inferior belly of the omohyoid muscle, anterior border, formed by the posterior edge of the sternocleidomastoid muscle, and the inferior border, formed by the clavicle. The contents of this triangle are the third part of the subclavian artery, brachial plexus trunks, and the nerve to the subclavius muscle and lymph nodes. Let's have a look. So this is the lateral view. And as you can see, this is the posterior edge of the sternocleidomastoid muscle, which forms the anterior border. This is the inferior belly of the omohyoid muscle, which forms the superior border. And this is the clavicle, forming the inferior border. So this is the omoclavicular triangle. Second subtriangle is the occipital triangle. The borders include the anterior border, formed by the posterior margin of the sternocleidomastoid, posterior border, formed by the anterior margin of the trapezius muscle, and the inferior border, formed by the inferior belly of the omohyoid muscle. The contents of this triangle include the accessory nerve, branches of the cervical plexus, uppermost part of the brachial plexus, and supraclavicular nerve. Let's have a look. Again, this is the lateral view of the neck. This is the anterior border, formed by the posterior margin of the sternocleidomastoid muscle, same as the omoclavicular triangle. This is the anterior margin of the trapezius muscle, which forms the posterior border. And this is the inferior belly of the omohyoid muscle, which forms the inferior border. So this is the occipital triangle. With this, we have completed the posterior triangle of the neck, and we move on to the last part, that is the sternocleidomastoid region. It is a key muscular landmark in the neck because it visibly divides each side of the neck into anterior and lateral cervical regions. The sternocleidomastoid muscle has two heads. The rounded tendon of the sternal head, which attaches to the manubrium, and the thick fleshy clavicular head, which attaches to the superior surface of the medial third of clavicle. These two heads are separated inferiorly by a space visible superficially as a small triangular depression called as the lesser supraclavicular fossa. With this, we have completed all the triangles of the neck. So that is it for this video guys. Don't forget to subscribe the channel and follow us on Instagram. Links in the description.